Thank you for the introduction. I learned a new surname. Often you don't know, you're the last one to know your surname. So now I know. Thank you very much for the invitation. The remarks I would like to share are very high level. I will take maybe a step back from the more granular approach of the last couple of presentations. This morning, in the opening remarks, there was a very thought-provoking point about the five by Kostas, by the five revolutions that the energy world is facing, and he mentioned the penetration of renewable energy, batteries, digitalization, hydrogen technologies, and mobility. So I like lists of revolutions, but when you start with the list of revolutions, it's hard to stop. So what I propose to do is to add five more. The first one is a revolution also on the supply side, but affecting oil, so to justify my nickname. Innovation and really disruption in supply technology is not just on the renewable side, although certainly it is largely very, very dramatically the case in renewables, but it's also the case in traditional hydrocarbons. So one of the major developments today, in my view, has been and continues to be the surge in shale production and the emergence of shale oil and gas production, so far largely in the US, but possibly spreading in other sectors. And just to put it very briefly, I won't be too long, but I think it's really a disruptive phenomenon, partly because of the perception of abundance that is created, replacing the previous perception of scarcity in the time of high oil prices and the age of easy oil is over and that sort of things that we mentioned this morning. But shale is very, very disruptive, mostly because it's a very different business cycle, very different business model compared to traditional oil and gas. It's low initial investments, very short business cycle, very quick payback time, very short lead times. So it makes it's problematic in some ways for renewables because it creates an environment of lower for longer oil prices, which perhaps are competition for renewable, make it more difficult to finance renewable. It's also an opportunity for renewable energy in unlocking gas, which can be balancing, which can help balance the intermittency of renewables and help integrate gas in the grid. But it's a challenge for investing in oil and gas. It's a huge challenge for OPEC, which OPEC has not resolved. As OPEC meets next week, it will continue to grapple with the problem of shale. It's a problem because investments in long-term traditional oil and gas projects have become much more difficult because of the uncertainty provided by the possibility of a quick response from short cycle shale production in both oil and gas. So that's a major disruption, which is compounded by the risks, the perception of risks of stranded assets, having to do with the perception of peak demand. So that also makes it more difficult to invest, and that possibly creates the stage for a supply shortfall in a somewhat counterintuitive way. But because investment is so difficult today in big ticket items, we haven't seen much investment in the last 2.5 years. Only now, 3 years after the beginning of the price decline, do we see some investments in serious projects. So there's a risk of a shortfall, of a run-up in prices back again in a few years, which could again create the stage for more investment and a repeat of a kind of super cycle that we've seen over the last few years. So that's a supply revolution that I see. On the demand side, we tend to focus very much on electric vehicles, and there's countless university centers now devoting a lot of work and producing really good research on the impact of electric vehicles, on the compounding impact of electric vehicles with ride sharing, with digitalization. and a lot of speculation about how quickly this will displace combustion engines and displace oil in transportation. But I would like to emphasize that on the demand side, the displacement of oil, the potential for peak oil demand, does not come entirely or only from electric vehicles, personal vehicles. Cars, personal vehicles, only represent about 25% of the demand barrel. There's another 75%. It's not clear how quickly electric vehicles really can penetrate the market. I would be much more conservative than some of the, I think, fairly aspirational scenarios where you have extremely rapid penetration of electric vehicles. I think it's going to take a long time for EVs to really penetrate the market. But I think that there's also a potential for much faster displacement of oil in other sectors. So in most forecasts, people assume high case, low case, whether you look at the BP scenarios or the HAEE scenarios, the consensus is that petrochemical demand for oil is going to remain extremely high no matter what happens, because emerging markets are becoming more affluent, and there's more demand for plastics, more demand for petrochemicals. That has to come from oil, and that's not carbon. It doesn't, so no concern about global warming. So I think this is probably misguided, and there's a lot of room for displacement of oil as a feedstock in petrochemical production, but more importantly, there's a huge potential for for efficiency gains and savings in plastics consumption, especially in packaging. And this is an area where innovation will be key, but recycling is very ineffective today. And even when recycling programs are in place, typically just about 5% of what goes into the recycling process ends up being really recycled. There's a potential for digitization to really increase that dramatically. So that's one of the areas where I see displacement. There was some reference today about the potential for LNG in marine transport. That's, again, also a very large potential. Freight transportation is also something that's been really driving oil demand. And there's room for displacement there in trucks, in railroads, and in the marine sector. But this is going to be very, very difficult. Right now, there's new standards for carbon emission, for sulfur emissions from ships from the International Maritime Organization, due to take effect in January 2020, which on the face of it would create the ideal setting for LNG penetration of the marine sector. It's not going to happen because the accompanying programs are not in place to really incentivize the development of a global network of LNG bunkering distribution, which is required to develop a fleet. So it's a chicken and egg problem. There's not enough LNG tankers because there's not enough LNG ports, but there's not enough investment in LNG ports because there's not enough LNG tankers or LNG ships to make those investments work. So here there's a huge requirement, huge need for policy support, both at the international level and at the local port level. The third revolution I would like to mention is the revolution in geopolitics. It's not just energy, it's also geopolitics. And renewables have very deep geopolitical implications. They are a challenge for countries that depend on oil and gas exports. And those countries are undergoing their own political transformation anyway, regardless of the renewable threat. So supply disruptions in the history of oil and gas and energy systems can have a really profound effect. We started this morning with some references to the crisis of the 1970s. The shocks of 1973 and 79 had a really huge impact on global consumption. In some countries, oil consumption never recovered after plummeting as a result of the shocks. There's a serious potential for renewed shocks. Political risk in producing countries is really on the rise in a very dramatic way. We see it today in Venezuela, which is at the breaking point, but there's very serious risks in Middle East producing countries as well to keep in mind. The fourth revolution is a revolution in policy making. Paris COP21 was a landmark 190 countries agreeing on setting policies for carbon. This was fantastic. But it's not all at the national level. And since Paris 2015, of course, we had the election in the US, a new president, and now concerns that perhaps the US could pull out of COP21, could seek to renegotiate its position, to reset its goals. And there's increasingly now awareness that policy is not entirely decided at the national level or at the state level, but very much at the local level. In the US, it's at the local state level, it's at the city level, and there's a need to really channel the policy making, the agenda setting capacity of localities, municipalities, ports, cities. Cities, after all, are the largest consumers of energy. And as urbanization continues, their role will be larger and larger. So there's here a huge nexus of research that needs to be done and room for rethinking international collaboration in a way that doesn't just bring countries together, nations together, as is the case in the International Energy Agency, but also brings cities together. And we're starting to see that in organizations like C40, which brings together the 40 largest cities. But there's a lot of room for more progress and more innovation in this space. And the last revolution I would like to suggest is the revolution in information and data science. The energy sector is a data information hungry sector. There's constantly investment decisions which are taken at the wrong time because of lack of information. As natural gas shale production in the US was surging, investments, multi-billion dollars investments, were being made in LNG importation plants because investors, even though the information was out there, had no access to the information about the surge in domestic production and thought that the US would continue to be net short gas and would need imports. So information is vital in the high investment energy sector, but is lacking more and more from conventional sources, from national statistics. But there's a huge amount of new sources of information which have not yet been mined from satellite pictures, from GPS, from telephones, from all kinds of non-conventional sources. And these sources of information are now in the process of being tapped, of being leveraged to generate new transparency in the market. And I think that's going to be an area which we'll see dramatic changes over the next few years, actually in the very near future. There's really, I'm myself involved in one startup company that looks at exploiting new data from satellite and other pictures, machine learning algorithms and so on, to create transparency about supply and demand and midstream stocks, transportation and so on in the oil and gas sector, but there's many others. And these, I think, will be completely disruptive and transformational in the next few months and will really create a new level of transparency for investments and for policy making. So that's my comments. Thank you.